Hello, once again to everyone. Today we are talking about the scientific thinking in psychology and the ways that we need you to consider all incoming information in order to become a good student in psychology, as well as just a good consumer of information in general. And so we'll be looking at a few psychological concepts and a few things just that are good to have in your awareness as you continue to go through and consume information in your daily life. So I'm going to ask you to start by just taking a look at the headlines on your screen. So as you look through these headlines, there's probably some of these that are looking very surprising. There's other ones that you're saying, yes, finally, I'm getting some validation on the things that I have thought about before, whether that happens to be that you just know that you're a better person because you read Harry Potter, or that you love your dog, or that you have friends, or you don't have as many friends as other people may think you do. But as you look at these headlines, there is one thing that every single one of them has in common. And that is that phrase, science says. So my question then, who is this all-knowing science that can come in and make declarations that science knows how many friends that I have, that science knows that I should shut up, that science knows that I don't eat enough pizza when I'm at work? So who is this science that is able to make all these decisions about my life? And so here we hopefully are coming into that first mental barrier. If you are a critical consumer of information, you should be starting to question this already. Because what we need to remember here is there's no science making declarations. So these headlines alone, by declaring that science says, have automatically caused themselves to lose some credibility in my viewpoint. And so what we end up seeing is these are not scientific studies that are being presented here. These are headlines, and a lot of these headlines have one purpose. That single purpose of so many headlines across the internet today. They want you to click on them because they get paid if you click on them and view the ads that are on that website. So what we see happening a lot are these headlines crediting science with this new field of information. But it's not anything that you should actually believe or take any credit into. To illustrate this point, I'm going to show a quick video from 2017, and it really shows how you can see a scientific study turn into a headline. So as I switch to this video, and this is from our local Channel 4 News in 2017, and as I switch to this, what I want you to think about is, what are they claiming? What is their big sensational science says headline? And what did the scientific study actually say? So keep both of those in mind as this video plays.
Gross, disgusting, nasty. Those are some of the words many kids would use to describe vegetables.
Well, it turns out vegetables might not be very fond of you either. Our Steve Harris is here to tell us about a really bizarre study that may change the way you think about veggies. Steve.
Oh, yeah, Mariz, look at that bag of baby carrots. Aren't they the cutest thing? Make you want to pop one right in your mouth, right? Maybe not. What if they knew you were about to EAT them? Sound ridiculous? We'll watch this. So who doesn't like biting into a vegetable now and then? Well, maybe the vegetable.
Help me!
According to a study by the University of Missouri, plants know when they're being eaten, and they don't like it. Researchers found that the vibrations caused by caterpillars munching on thale crests trigger the release of mildly toxic oils to keep the predators away. Still feel like porking out on produce?
All diets should have a mixture of different vegetables.
I asked clinical dietitian Elizabeth Hatchard what she thought about all this. What if I told you there was a study that said vegetables know when we're eating them and they don't like it?
They can do more studies and maybe learn about plants' own defense against pests, and maybe it can help with, pest control and growing more and help like the agriculture business.
So how do you think this carrot feels right now?
Oh, he doesn't mind. It's his job. He's making you healthy.
All right, that makes sense. But I wanted to know how the general public would react to this new knowledge. When I do this,
Turnip.
how do you think that makes the turnip feel?
He took a bite out of me. Help.
How do you think it makes it feel?
How does the Brussels sprout? I have no clue.
When I do this to this radish, how do you think the cauliflower feels?
It's a vegetable, so I didn't think it had feelings.
I think it makes it feel bad. You took a big chunk out of that. Not gonna lie.
I don't know.
How do you think it makes the pepper feel?
I feel like it makes the pepper feel really upset that you're taking a bite out of it. And I feel like it's really upset about that.
That's what they say. That is, in fact, what they say. What do you guys think? What do you think?
I just can't believe I've eaten baby carrots. I didn't know I was so horrible.
You got so many looks. What is wrong with this guy?
Yeah, that's
Why
my
is
next
he
story.
doing
What is
this?
wrong with this guy? Exactly.
Well, very interesting story. I really like this one today, Steve.
Yeah,
Okay.
good stuff.
So, did you pick up on it? Did you hear the headlines that are going to get you to talk about this article? Vegetables know when they're being eaten. Except when you actually listen to that one little line, and he even dropped his tone and he was a little quieter and spoke a little bit faster. And he says there was a study done at Mizzou that says there is one specific type of plant, the veil cress, that will secrete a toxin when it vibrates when a caterpillar walks on it. And they are going to take that one study and sensationalize it to the level of saying, oh, vegetables feel it when you're eating them. And so when we look at headlines like the ones that you see on your screen, it's very important for us to realize we have not read the study. Sometimes the person who wrote the headline has not read the study. They are looking for a way to generate more clicks, and we need to stop consuming what the media is saying to try to consume clicks and really start looking for where is this knowledge coming from and pursuing these with a much more critical eye. So when we can start going in and exploring these a little bit more, Harry Potter makes you a better person according to science. And if we start to explore the study a little bit more, we start to see things like, well, Harry Potter has never said you're a better person. Science didn't say you're a better person. What they said is that those people are more likely to recognize certain thought patterns and that may make you judge people differently. And so they have then changed that into better person. So when we get into this, and as you can continue to consume information throughout your life, please keep in mind, science didn't say this. What science did was one scientist or a team of scientists conducted an actual scientific study. And then they published their results. And as they published these results, then they made some sort of statement based on that particular group of people that they studied. But then someone trying to get some clicks opened it up and sensationalized it. And what I hope you get out of the rest of this video is to look for where the roots of science actually come from and not from the sensationalized headlines. And so when we are talking about psychology, I want to remind you again of the definition we're using in this class. That psychology is the scientific study of behaviors and mental processes. Big emphasis right now on scientific. So that means we have to use scientific methodology. We have to think in a scientific way in order to declare the things that we declare in this field. So what this requires a different mindset. This requires us to go through and say that the things that I think, the things that seem correct in my life might not actually be right. And there's plenty of things that happen like that. So most of the general public will say, if I win the lottery, I know I'll be happier for the rest of my life. Or even if maybe not happier, I'll be richer for the rest of my life. And what the studies show is those things aren't true. People that win big lottery jackpots typically rate themselves as lower happiness and are more likely to declare bankruptcy later in life than people who aren't. The only way that we see correlations with money and happiness is if you are barely surviving. But if you are making enough money to be able to meet your basic needs, more money does not make people happier. And so that's a common misconception. But when we start to really look into the science, it shows us something that goes against the things that we're thinking. And so it requires that sometimes we need to take that and realize that maybe there's something that that maybe there's something about the world or about myself that I think is true that might not be. And so then we get into critical thinking and the scientific method as part of where we are going to take the rest of this video. So a few key questions that are really important if you're being asked to think critically. So what is this person trying to get me to believe? And there's another question that's not on the screen of why. Why are they trying to get me to believe this? Is it because that they want me to spend money? They want me to get clicks and view their advertisements? Is there some other motive behind making me believe this particular thing, fact, or idea that they're presenting to me? And so then I need to seek out evidence. What evidence is there to support the thing that they are asking me to believe? So, and it is important that we can look at the evidence that's presented to us by the person who's presenting the belief, but it's very critical that we also look for other evidence and other ways to interpret that evidence. There are all kinds of examples where you can take statistics and make them sound one way, but then you present them a slightly different way and they send a completely different message. And so it's very important for us to look through and say, how can we examine the alternatives to what this evidence is? What evidence is there to support the counterpoint to this idea that they're trying to get me to believe? And then, of course, that logical conclusion at the end. So now that I've seen all these viewpoints and I've weighed the evidence, what actually seems to be the most reasonable? In the unit resources, I'm going to link another video from James Randi, who is one of the most famous skeptics. And we look at him as always questioning and always willing to challenge the ideas that seem most reasonable. And so I'd like you to take a look at that video just as another way to emphasize the way you can start to look at and challenge some of the ideas that might seem very convincing on the surface, but maybe it's just because we don't know the right ways to really think about some of those other things that are happening. So one of the things to consider is when we're studying psychological research, it's never perfect. There's no scientific study out there that is perfect. So a good scientist is going to try to predict what these problems are. They are going to try to prevent them from showing up, and from there, make their study more relevant and more valid. But one of the great psychology teachers I've worked with in the past uses the game of whack-a-mole as a great example for this. And if you've played whack-a-mole, you know that this basically is always having a little mole pop up and you're supposed to knock it back down. But the problem is, no matter how good you get at whack-a-mole, there's always another one that's popping up. And so when you're creating a study or when you're reading studies, it's really important to look for those little things that keep popping up that you know shouldn't be there, and hit as many of those as you can, but then realize there's always more. And if you don't see them, they're still there, and you just don't have the skills yet to be able to identify some of them. But that is one of the things we develop in this class, is that critical thinking, the ability to start finding those moles as they show up, and then giving you the tools to be able to whack them and figure out well, let's get rid of that and make our study more effective. And really, when it comes down to analyzing a study, a lot of times what we have to do is minimize the moles in our own, but then understand that the more moles there are in a research, the less valid the conclusions of that study are. And so the less stock you should put in your belief. So now we've talked about the whack-a-moles. We've talked about how media can sensationalize psychological studies. But now we want to get into where we get that self-doubt, where our own ideas can prevent us from believing or understanding psychological research. And so when we break free of our own ideas, there are 3 critical things that we need to get rid of so that we can think more critically than we could have otherwise. And so the first of these we call the hindsight bias. And so there's that old phrase, hindsight is 20/20. And you look back and you see everything crystal clear. The problem here is once you look back, you have all of the information now. And so of course it looks clear. But what humans do is once we have all of that information, we can't imagine what life would be like without this information. And so we convince ourselves that we have known all of this information from the very beginning. Now, what we need to think of is, no, you didn't. You didn't know this, because if you did know this, you wouldn't have responded in the way that you did. And so I love reviewing that old Taylor Swift song. And you can see that main line on there, that I knew you were trouble when you walked in, so shame on me now. But then we look into why, if you knew he was trouble as soon as he walked in, why is it that you're laying on the cold, hard ground right now, crying and writing a sad song about it? And the logical answer is you didn't know. You're looking back and saying, hey, now I know that you were trouble. But the bias just makes us look back and think we knew stuff from the very, very beginning. So that is one thing, is realizing that once we get information, it's very hard for us to look back and perceive things the way that we perceived them before we had that information. Another thing that humans are very likely to do is get overconfident. And so with overconfidence, we have this idea that our abilities are so much higher than they really are. And so we see this all of the time. We inflate our own abilities and our own understandings to be able to convince ourselves of something. Very often in an academic setting, we don't study for a test as much as we should because I paid attention in class. I watched all the videos. I did all the work, and so I'm going to ace this test. But what you really needed was some time to review. And if you never spent that time to review, you're feeling way too confident because you went through certain actions, and that overconfidence will end up resulting in you performing worse than you would have otherwise. The third thing that we need to worry about is the confirmation bias. And I feel like the best explanation I've ever seen for this is right here in that first comic strip. We have this idea that we are right, and so we look for the evidence that supports the idea that I'm right. And I would like you to consider your own behavior when you're scrolling through the internet or when you're scrolling through your social media. We spend a lot of time just scrolling. And we remember certain concepts, but we typically remember the things that line up with our existing ideas. And if we present that to you and you're like, well, you scrolled through 5 things that disagreed with your ideas, we'll argue with them. No, we didn't. It didn't even go past your sensory memory to be encoded, which helps contribute to your overconfidence that you're correct. And so we typically think a lot of people think the way we do because we look for the information that supports that viewpoint. And it doesn't matter whether you actually are in the majority or whether you're in a very tiny minority. It's a human tendency to believe more people think like we do, and we ignore all of the evidence that contradicts that, and we focus very much on the evidence that supports it. A question I ask a lot of times in my psychology classes is, how much homework do you think the average student completes? And what I have found is answers vary widely. Some students will say, oh, no one ever does any homework. Other students will say, well, everyone does their homework all the time and it's always on time. And then you get every answer in the middle. And one of the trends that I've noticed, being the teacher who actually knows how much homework students turn in, is those students who think that no one ever does any work in class are the ones who typically don't do work. And they assume that everyone else is doing like they are. And it's the same with those students who are turning in everything and every assignment is perfect and it's all always done on time. They assume that most students are like they are. And as always, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Most students do most of the work, but the vast majority of us are going to look for all those evidence and all those confirming pieces that everybody else does, even though it might not be true, and even though we might overlook 10 pieces of contradicting evidence along the way. So let's see how well you're doing in terms of your critical thinking so far. There is a movement that is spreading online right now, and I'm going to bring up a couple of the screenshots from their webpage. It's called the Ban Dihydrogen Monoxide movement. And the idea here is there's this invisible chemical that is present in nearly everything. And it's responsible for so many deaths around the planet and so much damage around the planet, but yet we're not doing anything about it. And so there's a movement out there to ban dihydrogen monoxide. So take a few minutes, read through some of the points that are here. I'll stop talking for about 30 seconds, let you just skim through this slide and see what's there. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a few more. This goes into more of that meme category. Again, trying to spread the message. So we see Jeff, who has this addiction. He's been a professional athlete, but he's now addicted to dihydrogen monoxide. And he is now to the point that he will die if he doesn't get it in the next 3 days. But this chemical is everywhere. We see that it's in both the juice that our kids drink as well as the intense chemicals that we use to clean. It causes damage to pipes and intensive cravings that can ultimately result in death. So I ask you at this point, are you thinking scientifically? Are you ready to go off on a crusade to ban dihydrogen monoxide from the planet? Or are you starting to think, hey, what are some of those other points of view? And if I bring us back to that very first slide on how to start critically thinking, what are you being asked to believe? And of course, the question here is, well, dihydrogen monoxide is a killer. And what evidence is available? I presented it all to you, and I could present numbers of how many people it kills every single day and every single year. I don't have those freely available, but I could find them and present them to you. But then you get to the other question. What other ways could the evidence be interpreted? And now we get into some of these ideas that, well, let's take another look at just the phrase dihydrogen monoxide. So we can see dihydrogen. Let's start with that. So dihydrogen refers to the element of hydrogen, and di, of course, meaning two. So it's the prefix, two hydrogens, and then monoxide. So oxide, of course, referring to the oxygen element being included, and mono referring to one. So what we're looking at is this chemical is two atoms of hydrogen paired with one atom of oxygen. If we were going to chemically write that, DHMO is not the correct chemical equation for that. The correct chemical equation for this is H2O. So now, if we go back once again, what other ways could the evidence be interpreted? Oh, well, maybe we made the connection way before I presented it to you. Maybe we didn't. But, oh, H2O, that's water. That's a big piece of evidence that some people could figure out and some people couldn't. But that's a whole new trend to believe. And if we revisit the memes again, they all make complete sense in this line of thought too. Yes, there's water in bleach and there's water in juice. Jeff will die along with the rest of us if we don't consume any water in the next 3 days. So the statements here are true, but they were twisted so far outside of normal rational statements that they can get convincing. And so it's so easy to do that, especially when you don't have knowledge of a certain area. And so it's very important that we continue to keep that critical thinking mindset. Now, I have one more piece as we talk about scientific research, and I really, really hope that this is just a review from all of the science classes you've had up until now. So I don't want to go through with a lot of detail in the scientific method. If I need to, of course I can, and please ask if that's something you feel like you need. I like to just use the baby here as a refresher for students. So the baby knows the scientific method. Let's make an observation. Hey, look, there's something. I wonder what that is. I wonder if it tastes good. So we form that hypothesis, and you should be aware psychology does have a few extra pieces to building a good hypothesis, and we're going to visit those in class in person. So please be aware if you're watching this that step 2 of forming a hypothesis, we will explore significantly more in our in-person classes, especially for those of you taking AP. So this baby has the hypothesis. I think this thing I found on the floor tastes good. So perform the experiment. At that point, we have the hypothesis. Let's test it. We put it in the mouth and, oh, wait, that doesn't look so good. As we analyze the data, but then we share our findings. And the part that students often forget about in developing the scientific method are these last 2 steps. Once we finish the study, we have to report our findings. That doesn't mean that science has found anything yet. Now, sometimes the media will pick up those headlines from a single study and present it like it's fact with that science says tagline, but that doesn't mean it is. So what we need before we can actually declare that to have any validity whatsoever is a process we call replication. You do need to know that word of replication. So replication is when other scientists will repeat that study as closely as they can, but with new groups of people, hopefully with even more people than the first study were done. And then if those results are the same, well, let's report that out. Let's replicate again and replicate again and replicate again. Because if we're going to actually say as a scientific community that something is true, we need to have a lot of evidence backing this up. And eventually, if we can replicate over and over and over again in different situations with different groups of people, then we can maybe come up with a theory. And it's very important in psychology classes that we use the word theory correctly. When we use the word theory, we are declaring that this statement has an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports it, and a very small, if any, evidence that goes against it. Again, this is not the confirmation bias where we're looking for it and we're ignoring it. This means we are looking at all of the evidence that's available, and nearly all of it points towards this conclusion. And so this is where if you hear someone dismissing a theory by saying, oh, well, that's just a theory, there's a difference between casual use of a word and proper scientific use of a word. So the proper scientific use of the word of theory means, wow, there's a lot of evidence behind that. So in psychology, we talk about the evolutionary approach based on the theory of evolution. And of course, when we use that in a scientific methodology, that means there is a ton of evidence that supports this idea of evolution and natural selection, survival of the fittest. Now, there will be people that say, well, I don't like that. That's just a theory. And what they're really stating is they don't understand the scientific meaning of the word theory. You can't dismiss it like a casual use of the phrase. There needs to be evidence that contradicts it, and you need a growing amount of evidence in order to go against a theory. If we just say, well, I have a theory of some random thing that I think, that's not a scientific use. And you can say that, but you can't confuse the two when we're starting to get into it. So as we have gone through this video, we have tried to make you consider a scientific thinking from a critical consumer of information. So we want you to think about where the information is coming from. What are the motives behind that information? What evidence is there to support it? What other ways can I interpret that evidence? What are my own internal cognitive biases that keep me from understanding it? And where does this information actually come from before I can present it and believe it as scientifically supportive evidence? So once again, we will explore a little more of this in person in class. I'm looking forward to working through this and exploring this with you, and excited to take this new scientific point of view as we continue to explore psychology even further and the scientific study of behaviors and mental processes.